I'm Jen Taylor Skinner, and this is the Electorette. On this episode, I have a conversation with AG, the co-host of the award-winning podcast, Mueller, She Wrote. We talk about the Mueller Report, of course, and the impeachment trial, but AG also opens up about something that she doesn't talk about very often publicly, and that's her being sexually assaulted while she was in the military. And we talk about what so often happens to victims of sexual assault. She was blamed, she wasn't believed, and the person who assaulted her was never held accountable. And although we don't go into the details of the assault, I do want to caution listeners who may be sensitive to this type of content that we start this part of the conversation at approximately 6 minutes into the recording. I hope this episode is helpful to people, and thanks so much again to AG for sharing this personal and painful story. So here is my conversation with AG of Mueller, She Wrote. AG, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So first off, I thank you for joining me, but I just want to ask you, so you're still working in government and you're working in, I'm not really sure what branch you're in, but you're semi-anonymous, right? So I guess my first question, the first thing I wanted to know was, how have you managed to stay? Like, how have you wanted to stay, first of all? Because people are leaving, government and this administration specifically left and right.
Well, it's kind of a long story, and I'm sort of in limbo right now. And legally, I have been advised not to really go into too many details, but everything's sort of up in the air, and I'm working on it, and it's interesting. That's about the most I can say.
Yeah, I wasn't really sure because I was thinking, if you were me, or if I were you, rather, the idea of working in government and starting the podcast that you've started, I would be nervous. I don't think I could go forward with, were you nervous before you started Mueller, She Wrote? How did you get over that hump and decide to go ahead and do it?
Well, I was, and in fact, there are some things I can divulge. First of all, the Trump administration's Office of General Counsel had requested my employee documents and employee records a little bit. I think it was right around the time I was starting the podcast, and that made me really, really nervous. But what I did was I went out and I spoke to an attorney who is an expert at the Hatch Act and First Amendment rights, and had multiple ongoing discussions about what I could and couldn't say, and what I could and couldn't tweet, and all the ways that I was trying to go forward ethically as a government employee without violating any rules or, agency policy.
Yeah. So I'm assuming you were in the same position before the administration took office, or did you only take it afterwards? And I'm curious as to how the mood and tenor has necessarily changed, since the beginning. Have you seen it we've all seen it from the outside kind of decline, but what has it been like being that close to everything?
Well, I've been with this agency for 12 years, almost 12 years.
Okay.
And in fact, I took the oath of office the same day Obama took the oath of office.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And so I'm a high-level, low-level employee. And
got it.
So think of this. You remember Lisa Page, the lawyer who had teamed up with Strzok on the Mueller team, and she was, sort of publicly humiliated by Trump, at every turn. Her and I have the same level in the government. We're both GS-14s. And the rules she has to follow and the rules I have to follow are pretty much the same. And that's sort of where that is. But to answer your question about how it's changed, as soon as in my agency specifically, there was a lot of movement to deregulate and to privatize, which put our customers in peril. And so the morale sank quite a bit, and there was a drain. A lot of people left. And then a lot of people, if you remember when Mick Mulvaney said, we have a new way to get rid of employees we don't like, we just move their jobs across the country. A lot of my colleagues lost their positions that way as well.
What does privatization do? I'm assuming that gives them a lot more control over what they can do and say when you privatize, right?
Well, basically what it means is instead of directly offering the services to our customers through the government, we were hiring outside private entities to perform these tasks, and it still is costing the taxpayers a lot of money. The service is substandard. And it's just bad for everyone. It's kind of like if you think about, and I don't work for Department of Prisons, but you can imagine if you work for the government and you're running and regulating the prisons, and then all of a sudden you privatize the prison system, you're going to get people who are more concerned about turning a profit than they are about saving taxpayer dollars and being a ward of taxpayer dollars and giving the best service possible. So if you think about it along those lines, you can kind of imagine sort of where we were all at when Trump took office.
Yeah, I just, props to you. I couldn't do it. I my nerves would get the best of me, and there'd be lots of drinking and lots of stuff. Yeah. I do want to ask you, and I don't know if you've ever talked about this publicly, but one of the things that you've been dealing with and we wanted to talk about was being a victim of sexual assault, specifically military sexual assault. And as a result, you've had to deal with PTSD. Can you talk a bit about this? Because this happened before the Me Too movement. And I would imagine that, being in the military is not the best environment for empathy. So, I mean, tell me what happened there.
Sure. I joined a long time ago. I was one of the first women into the nuclear program. And after boot camp, I went to Naval Nuclear Power Training Command in Orlando. And it was me and 3 other women and 600 men. And before we arrived, they all had to have this sensitivity training, which immediately just made them all hate us. And when I got there, I noticed, first of all, they didn't have the facilities for us. Second of all, they didn't have a GYN on staff. There was just a lot to contend with, along with the fact that all of these guys were already like, oh, God, now we have to take special training because the ladies are here.
Yeah.
And so it was just the environment just wasn't professional, we'll say. And about 3 months into A school, I was raped by a fellow member of the military. And when I went to report it, I was pretty much scared out of reporting it. They asked me all the questions that you sometimes hear victim blaming people ask, like, were you drunk? What were you wearing? Were you flirting? And then they said if I filed a false report, I could be kicked out of my school. I could lose my benefits. I could be dishonorably discharged. And so, they said, why don't we just chalk this up to what it really is, your bad decisions. And so I kept my mouth shut about it, and I was terrified about saying anything to anyone for a long time. And that manifested into PTSD. You can't hide from trauma. And so it eventually comes up and started happening after I got out of the military in the form of panic attacks and anxiety and depression, and finally got the care that I needed and have been doing better ever since. But that's the long and short of it. And you're right. It all happened before the Me Too movement, but thank God that the Me Too movement happened. Thank God that we're sort of it's 2020. We shouldn't be here at all, but we're in a much better place than we were then to talk about what's happened to us.
Yeah. Well, I'm so sorry that happened to you. I mean, I can't imagine. So I was just thinking about the environment that you described, right? You go in and it's obvious in the way that they've set it up that they're kind of hostile to women being in that environment generally, right? You don't have an OBGYN, right? There's 600 men. And so, the messaging there is that, you're not really welcomed here legally. You can be in the military, but this isn't a place where we actually want women. So first of all, you're dealing with that. And then you end up dealing with sexual assault. And I would imagine that because they don't want you to talk, it's hard for you to find anyone around you that has any empathy, including the other 2 women who were there. I would imagine that they're probably afraid to be an ally to you.
Yeah. And there's, repercussions for that because you want to be one of the guys so that, you don't have to deal with the onslaught of microaggressions every day. But I was in a film in 2012. It was a documentary by Amy Ziering called The Invisible War. And I recorded my interview for that movie. And it wasn't until I actually was at the premiere and saw the film that I realized that there were tons of other women and men who had gone through exactly what I went through with the same phrasing. What were you wearing? Were you drunk? Etc. Didn't you, shouldn't you maybe have not done this? Maybe you shouldn't have been wearing what you were wearing. Perhaps, if you file a false report, where they threatened him with all these other things. And they put my interview in a montage with, like I said, several other women and men who had the exact same treatment, exact same phrases and verbiage given to them, the same garbage. And right then is when I finally felt like, okay, I'm not crazy, and that there are other people that this exact thing has happened to. And that was so amazing to feel not alone anymore. That was probably the minute I realized that, I've been gaslit for so many years. I'm not crazy. This happened, and it happened to a lot of other people.
Yeah, gaslighting is the perfect word for what they actually do. And that's amazing that was 2012, because I think the Me Too movement was fall of 2016, I think, right? So that was 4 years before. And like now, I think people are better about talking about it publicly, but it doesn't mean that there's going to be any accountability necessarily, right? I mean, I was thinking about like the presidential debates with the primary. No one's really talked about the Me Too movement, right? So I feel like in some ways we've made a lot of progress, but still there's huge pockets where there is no accountability, right?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we did have that little skirmish between Warren and Sanders about, can a woman win, and who said what. But that's really and that was supposed to be behind the scenes. We weren't supposed to know about that, I don't think. And really that's kind of it, except for, the candidates talking about women can win. They haven't really gone into the Me Too movement.
Right. And, the thing is that, you mentioned Warren and Sanders. I really thought that was going to be the turning point where they'd start to talk about this because, people kind of keep sexual assault and the PTSD and all of the other fallout that happens to victims. They kind of keep that in a bubble. Like, okay, the sexual assault happened to you and maybe you'll have some mental health challenges or, you'll have PTSD, but the fallout is longer than that, right? It's longer and broader, right? Like, PTSD, getting jobs later, just functioning in relationships and with friendships. When you have trouble in your career because of the PTSD, that affects your income, right?
You're exactly right. It broadens that scope of concern on the economy. And then to take it even a step further, how it can hurt your income or it can negatively impact your income. That negatively impacts tax revenue, which negatively impacts our deficit, which negatively impacts the amount of money we can spend on things like healthcare and education. And it's terrible that they don't make that connection, but they don't.
Well, the reason I brought it up is because, if someone were not comfortable, because we've got a lot of men still left in the primary, bringing it up purely from a sexual assault perspective, which they should be at this juncture. So there are lots of other ways that they could connect it to things that they like talking about, like healthcare and mental health care, because mental health care is healthcare, right? And to the impacts to women economically. So anyway, that was my point, that there are other ways they could connect it.
Ready for your next adventure? KLM Royal Dutch Airlines brings you Real Deal Days, your chance to uncover real adventures and create real memories. Taste the real Amsterdam, explore the real Barcelona, and discover the real Johannesburg, along with many more destinations around the world. Secure your real deal today and seize the moment with KLM Royal Dutch Airlines. Restrictions apply. See terms and conditions at klm.com.
So what happened in your case? Did you get any justice or did you just leave? How did that get resolved?
No, no justice. I didn't file the report. I was told if I did, many, many bad things would happen. So I just got out of the military when I had a chance. And I did file a claim with the Department of Veterans Affairs. It was denied multiple times, but I ended up speaking to retired Brigadier General Allison Hickey, who's a really incredible woman. She was running the Women's Health Benefits Center in Washington, D.C. for the Department of Veterans Affairs at the time. She had seen the movie I was in and called to ask how I was doing. And I told her it's been hard. The VA has denied my claim 3 times, saying that because there was no evidence, because I didn't file a report, they couldn't verify that it actually happened. And she said, wow, that's been happening a lot lately. And then within 2 weeks, I had gotten a phone call that my examination for a disability was approved. And finally, the Navy and the Department of Veterans Affairs acknowledged what happened to me and compensated me for it. But it did take, it was 2012 when that compensation happened. So that's 95, that's 17 years,
Wow.
17 years.
Do you think that's intentionally a part of the punishment? I don't know. Maybe I'm being too conspiratorial.
I don't think so. I think the problem is that, the VA is underfunded. They have a massive backlog of claims that they were dealing with at the time. Plus, then they just started awarding Agent Orange all the way back for people in Vietnam just recently.
Yeah.
And so the backlog for claims just got huge. And then, of course, it's sort of had this environment of no, because if you denied the claims, people, especially people with PTSD or, traumatic brain injury, just didn't have the capacity or the drive to fight it. And it was just such a fight that most people gave up, and that would save the VA money.
That just makes me so angry, right? That's the last thing you should be doing is trying to fight for your benefits when you're also trying to take care of yourself. You know what I mean? It's just, anyway.
Yeah, and ask anyone with PTSD how much fun it is to fill out 8,000 forms and show up again and again and repeat what happened to you over and over and relive the trauma so that they can verify that something happened. It's really bad. And I've said for many years about the Department of Veterans Affairs, if they stopped adjudicating claims, if they stopped hiring people and spending money and administration fees to decide how disabled someone is, if we didn't spend any of that money, we'd be able to give free health care to veterans, all veterans for life.
Yeah. You started working in government a while ago, right? And so you were there before this administration. You saw the inauguration and you saw the way it's gone. I'm just curious, when it was clear that Trump, first of all, was going to get the nomination. And then, I guess you can say he won, quote unquote, won the election. I guess another word to say he's occupying the White House right now, or occupying the Oval Office. Thinking about what we know about him, the Access Hollywood tapes and all of the other stories about him being accused of rape, I would imagine that was additionally traumatizing to you. Like it was to a lot of us.
Yeah, it's disgusting, right? And one of the ongoing issues that a lot of women have to contend with when going to the Department of Veterans Affairs, specifically for women and men who face military sexual trauma, hanging right there in the front reception area of every single Department of Veterans Affairs and Veterans Health Administration hospital is a giant picture of Donald Trump. And you have to walk past that every time you go in. It's just just a reminder of where we are as a country and how backwards everything is, considering everything that he's done. We have 21 women now that have come out and, credibly accused him of assault. And as you said, the Access Hollywood tape, it's tough. It's a re-traumatization is what it is. It makes it difficult.
Right. So you can imagine this, right? But just think about the idea of a victim having the person who is in the most powerful position in the world, really, being someone who sexually assaults people. And I just can't even fathom the additional trauma that people go through, seeing this person day in and day out. So that just makes me very sad.
Yeah. And you put that in the context of him having to adjudicate my health care as a veteran, and then also having to be my boss as an executive branch employee. It's like a triple whammy.
And then, of course, picking Supreme Court justices like Brett Kavanaugh and that thing, like going through that. That, again, is just unfathomable.
Yeah, that was another one. That was another just awful moment in our history. I wish there was some way to undo it. Like, I wish there was like, hey, if you're an impeached president, we have take backsies on your Supreme Court nominations.
I'm kind of diverging here, but what do you think about that? Like, some people have thrown that out, but that doesn't seem to be plausible.
It's not really plausible, although Kamala Harris did say in the chamber today that while they are, adjudicating a trial about the impeachment of a president, that we should halt or put a freeze on all judicial nominations during this consideration. So she did put that out there, but taking back already nominated judges, and he's packed the courts. 1 out of every 4 judges is a Trump nominee now. And taking them back, I don't think is something that's feasible at this point, unfortunately. But maybe somebody will come up with something good. We can get a good lawsuit going, some class action or something, but I don't know. I don't see it.
Maybe Kamala Harris, right? Like, justice is on the ballot.
Right. I would love for her to become the attorney general and just do that. Just be like, all right, we're filing a class action suit against every single judicial nominee by this impeached president. Here we go.
Yeah. Well, speaking of PTSD, I don't know if you saw, I think this was last week when Ilhan Omar came out and said that the talk of war with Iran and, the escalations in the Middle East was causing her PTSD. And I think people generally have a misunderstanding about PTSD, that it can only happen in the military due to war, like being actually in combat, right? But, in her case, she has PTSD because, I think she was a refugee as a child. And in your case, because of sexual assault, people generally have a misunderstanding of PTSD.
Yeah, I actually think that a lot of people probably have to deal with PTSD without realizing that they have it because, like you said, we're all under the impression you can't unless you were in a war. And the symptoms are the same too. Like, for example, loud noises really impact me. And a lot of people for a long time thought that was because of bombs and guns and rockets. But it's not. It's because you're constantly, you've had a traumatic event happen in your life and you're constantly in fight, flight, or freeze mode. And so when you're on that high alert all the time, any loud noise is going to set you off, or, maybe trigger a panic attack, or create this just huge sense of fear. And so I think you're right. I think it's unfortunate. And I think that's another symptom of what you were talking about earlier. The fact that we don't have healthcare, mental health care is healthcare, and the fact that we don't have access to it in this country like we should. And, if you think that, you might have PTSD, to, please reach out and get some help and ask for help. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And there's huge amounts of support and resources available. And after the film came out, I spoke to a lot of women's studies groups and on a lot of college campuses, and we screened the film a lot. There were just a lot of women who didn't realize, who had been so gaslit and shamed and convinced it was their fault, that they actually believed that it was their fault. And so, I would hope everybody could reflect on that and never be afraid to reach out and just ask questions and get help. It's really, really made a huge difference in my life.
The thing about it is that if our institutions dealt with this differently, dealt with sexual assault specifically differently, I think they could avert a lot of the compounding trauma and the PTSD that victims deal with, right? Like, part of the PTSD and part of the trauma is because people don't believe you, right? Like, you're just compounding the trauma when you don't do that. You could help possibly people heal faster if we just dealt with it better in our institutions.
100% right. Like I said, if the VA hadn't denied my claim over and over again, I might be in a better place than I am, or at least was at the time.
So you're continuing Mueller, She Wrote, right? Like, even though Mueller isn't in the picture, just going to your podcast.
Yeah. Well, because we were asked about that. Well, Mueller investigation's over. You're going to change the name of your podcast, and our listenership has just grown. And is Mueller really over? Because, now we've got these lawsuits working their way through the Supreme Court, the court system, about getting the grand jury materials from the Mueller investigation, and also getting the testimony of Don McGahn for obstruction of justice, which could lead to additional articles of impeachment. But then you also have to think about the Ukraine connection between Manafort. This has been going on for a lot longer than the perfect phone call that moved the public needle enough to go forward with articles of impeachment. But it's all connected. And I think that broader story is going to start coming out now. And a lot of that has to do with what Mueller found. It's just a lot of people ended up not reading that report. It was a pretty big report.
Yeah, well, the thing is, it's just a perfect name. Me, as a listener, I always understood it was broader than Mueller, but that the name was kind of perfect. So, you don't have to change the name. Come on.
Thank you. And we do have a morning daily news show too, called the Daily Beans, which is less Mueller focused, but still out there to cover all the news, particularly leading up to 2020. And there's just so much news. It's almost impossible.
I was just curious, what did you think about the whole thing, about Mueller's testimony? My short theory is that, basically he was saying, peace out, America, see ya. I don't know. I expected a little more from that, but maybe I'm being unfair.
Well, a lot of people did. And I think he was diligent. I think when we get to see the grand jury materials, millions and billions of documentary evidence, the problem is that Mueller is very old school and very conservative. He followed that Office of Legal Counsel memo guideline of the Department of Justice that you can't indict a president. And because you can't indict a president, it's not fair to accuse him of committing a crime, even if you aren't charging him with one, because he doesn't have the ability to defend himself in a criminal court at that point. And so he said, look, here it all is, Congress. Now it's your job. The remedy for this is impeachment. And then he just did the casino hands and walked away. Pretty much.
Yep.
Pretty much how it went.
I mean, obviously you can't indict a sitting president, but you can put the evidence out there. You can put what you found out there, and I don't know.
Well, he did. In particularly Volume 2, there were 10 instances of obstruction of justice, 5 of which met all 3 component requirements to meet criminal felony level obstruction of justice. But he couldn't say he committed obstruction of justice because he felt constitutionally you can't accuse a person of a crime unless they have the ability to defend themselves, which would be a trial, which he couldn't get because he couldn't indict him. So it was just this weird catch-22.
Oh, I see. So you can't accuse them if you can't indict them? Is that the...
Right. Well, the other issue is, and this is kind of an important one, do you remember how he was asked, like, could he be prosecuted when he leaves office? And he said, yes, he can. And if Mueller came out and said, Trump is guilty of obstruction of justice, but I couldn't charge him with the crime, but he's definitely a criminal. He committed obstruction of justice. Here's all the ways. Then he would have tainted a future prosecution.
Oh.
Trump would have very easily been able to say, I can't get a fair trial because he called me a criminal. So he would be able to get his case dismissed and would walk scot-free. I mean, provided he's not pardoned for all of it anyhow. But Mueller didn't want to taint or hurt the potential of prosecuting him as a civilian once he's out of office.
Right. Okay, I get it now. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So what is he doing now? Is he on a beach somewhere, Mueller? He's probably in Hawaii.
Yeah, I would be. I'd be like, peace out. Like, I did my thing, and I shouldn't say I did my thing. I mean, he had 17 team members, and most of them probably did the work. He was just sort of a presiding, officiant, but hopefully having margaritas somewhere.
Exactly. Well, AG, thank you so much for joining me, and thank you for all of your work. And I love Mueller, she wrote.
Jen, thank you so much. I love your podcast. Please keep doing what you're doing. We have to just keep doing this until November and beyond.
Yeah, and beyond. Okay, thank you. Thank you for listening. The Electorette is independently created and produced by me, Jen Taylor Skinner. And of course, I'm the host. But I also do all of the editing, the audio, and the graphics. You name it, it's on my plate. So if you enjoyed this episode of The Electorette, please help The Electorette grow by subscribing. Just hit the subscribe button on whatever app you use to listen to podcasts. Also leave a review for The Electorette on iTunes. Lastly, one final way to help The Electorette is by following The Electorette on social media. That's @Electorette on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, keep up the good fight.